is time for another Badlands card review. I'm a little bit late on this one. I was traveling with the family today, but boy, did I return to some crazy shaman cards for this review. Some of these have kind of bonkers numbers. I mean, stuff gets really, really big here, as we're going to see up first with Doc Holiday, a new legendary for Shaman, 5 mana, 4/5. Battle Cry, if your deck has no duplicates, equip the Staff of the Nine Frogs. And the Staff of the Nine Frogs, as you can see here, number one, looks ridiculous. It is a 5 mana, 2/9. That is crazy durability. We're like at those Jiraxis plus levels there for durability. And it has an effect here. After your hero attacks, summon a 1/1 frog with taunt, and then each frog is bigger than the last. So you get a 1/1 frog, 2/2 frog, all the way up to, of course, a 9/9 frog, which if you do the math across all of those, that's actually 45 in total stats. Plus, of course, you got the Doc Holiday itself, so that's 4950 in stats bundled into this card, plus 18 total damage, of course, from the Staff of the Nine Frogs itself, which, as far as like value potential in a card is concerned, that is completely off the charts. This is almost kind of like a Jade Idol deck all by itself. You're like summoning these Jades that keep scaling turn after turn, which, listen, if the opponent doesn't have weapon removal and if the game stretches on long enough, you know, that kind of value is of course eventually going to overwhelm people. Not to mention just like a bunch of chip damage can start to add up into some pretty meaningful places. But, you know, free 7/7s, free 8/8s at the end of that chain is kind of crazy. Now, that said, of course, it's never that simple, is it? Because to get to that stage where you start summoning the 6/6s and 7/7s and 8/8s, and the ones that become really impactful, you have to kind of grind away a little bit to get there. That said, too, though, I don't think this is the biggest sacrifice as far as a turn is concerned, because even the first time you play Dr. Holiday here, you're getting a 4/5 body, you're getting that 1/1 frog, and you're getting 2 damage. So, like, maybe use that 2 damage to help, like, you know, clean up a little minion on board. You got a 1/1 to maybe interrupt the opponent's plans, slow down a minion trade a little bit, and that 4/5 is still developing some stats as well. So, you know, if you expect the game to go on another 4 or 5 turns, that's, you know, just maybe turn 9, for instance, if you play this on curve, that staff is going to start producing a lot of value and has already, you know, maybe hit the opponent for 8 damage or something, or cleaned up a few minions along the way. So basically, in a Highlander deck that has some defensive utility, it has the ability to stretch the game out. We've already seen a handful of healing cards for Shaman in this set. We're actually going to see another one already. So I think that's kind of coming together, and that means the opponent really has to use the weapon removal on the Staff of the Nine Frogs. If they do that, you probably got an Ignis in your Highlander deck as well. So you've got your Ignis weapon as a backup plan. If they use weapon removal on the Ignis, maybe you stick the Staff for a while. It kind of starts to all add up and overwhelm. And, you know, weapon removal as a weakness for cards is relevant. Obviously, it's relevant, particularly because this one is up for so long that it gives the opponent more and more time to find weapon removal. But that alone has never totally stopped weapons, as I recall anyway. They still find reasons to be played. Your opponent still has to run that and play that, and that's not always the best feeling sort of play. And I don't think you make a huge sacrifice here if things don't go right with the staff. That first turn is decent, and you play for that crazy upside potential on this one, where if the opponent doesn't have that answer to this, or you've already sussed it out with an Ignis or whatever, then they could definitely be in trouble. So, yeah, I kind of dig this card, man. I think it just does so much. The numbers get so crazy that this might actually be good, even though it does take a while to spin up. So moving on to our next legendary here, we have Scar the Catastrophe, a new 7 mana, 7/7 elemental, of course. Pretty cool looking dude, by the way. I like how his face is made out of the lightning, and he's got those funny little fists up here. He's just flinging cows to their death. It's sort of horrifying, but otherwise, I like the way he looks. He reads, Battle Cry, deal 1 damage to all enemies. That is both face and minion, so a board clear and a face attack all in one. And that is improved by each turn in a row you've played an elemental. So that's the big hurdle for this card. That same mechanic we saw teased earlier with that big elemental where you have to hit these in a row in order to make it feel like a good payoff. Because obviously, you know, just 2 or 3 elementals isn't going to feel very good for Scar. Like, this needs to be, I think, in that like 4 or 5, honestly, probably even bigger range to feel good. The first comparison that comes to mind for me with this card is something like Mordresh, the mage card, that was dealing 10 to face and the board, and that definitely felt good at that mark. I think Scar needs to get pretty close to that to feel good, because that was an 8-mana card there at the end when that was getting played a lot. And I actually think that was an easier condition to achieve as well. Like, it did sometimes take a lot of time and work to get Mordresh active, but it was inevitable. You knew you were going to get there at some stage. Scar has this real risk reward where if you skip a turn or you miss a part of your loop or you don't play that elemental right in a row, he resets back down to 1 and you've got to start over again on all that work. So that like 10 damage inevitability doesn't exist unless you keep pumping in the work. And you know, I don't think it's going to be impossible to play like 6 straight elementals and play this on turn 7 and it will feel like a good play. That's going to happen sometimes. There will be other instances where you have to miss a turn here or there because something just didn't line up right. Or alternatively, you have to build your deck with so many elementals to achieve the consistency necessary to meet these demands that the deck struggles to succeed in various metas because it's just like too minion dependent, doesn't have any reactivity, doesn't have enough card draw. Those sorts of gaps start to exist because of the demands the deck places on itself with these conditions that have to be met. So it's almost like either the deck is going to create a ceiling on this card or the card itself is going to create a ceiling depending on which direction you take that. Do I make the deck suffer or do I make the card suffer? Either of those might lead to a situation where this really has a problem hitting. So yeah, great on turn 7 when you hit for, you know, the max up to that point. You've played an elemental every single turn. That's going to be a great board swing. That's going to be some great chip damage, a cool finish for an elemental deck. But how often is that happening? Are you going to miss? Is this going to show up late? Are you going to have weird dead scenarios? Or is your deck going to suck because you've just built too many elementals? Those are the questions for this card. Now, if elementals do work, it might be because of this guy. I think I like this card quite a bit. The Minecart Cruiser is a 3-mana 4/5 elemental with Rush and Overload 2. And more importantly, Battle Cry, if you played an elemental last turn, don't overload. Now, importantly, this only demands that single elemental action instead of, you know, multiple turns in a sequence like our Scar card before. So you just gotta play an elemental on turn 2, which should not be particularly difficult to do. There are already a few cards that fit nicely into that slot. And then you get yourself a really clean turn 3 play here, which is, you know, a nice meaty 4/5 that can also take immediate trades, which is going to be important for these sorts of things. I will acknowledge, you know, this doesn't really compare favorably to cards like the old Wild Paw Knolls we saw showing up in Rogue as those like 0-mana 3/5s with Rush. This is just a 4/5 and you have to spend 3 on it. So, you know, it's probably not even going to drive kind of meta relevance as much as something like those Knolls, which at this stage are actually pretty old cards. But still, it's a good tempo play. It's a good body on board. If you do overload this, I don't even know if that's a disaster necessarily. Sometimes just taking a big turn 3 on this 4/5 will feel fine. And then you kind of fill in the gaps on turn 4 with a 2-drop, hopefully, to fill in. Although I guess to be fair, if you had the 2-drop, maybe you played it on turn 2, so perhaps that's still awkward and you have to hero power, or maybe you have a 2-mana non-elemental card that fits in instead. But ultimately, I like how this is a lot more tempo forward. I like how this offers some reactivity. It's still a big body to play towards as well, so this feels like one of the good kind of building blocks that would exist in a mid-game elemental tempo package. Now, a card that is not a mid-game card is the Walking Mountain. This is a 9-mana 4/16 elemental with Rush, Lifesteal, Mega-Windfury, and Overload 2. Now, I want to be clear, I freaking love cards like this. These like gigantic, needlessly large, needlessly greedy cards with just a pile of stuff on them, you know, Lifesteal, Mega-Windfury, what the heck, that's so freaking cool. So I absolutely adore the kind of shape of this card. Now that said, I do not think this is the sort of thing that's going to make much sense in an elemental deck. If you are running these elemental cards and you need that consistent turn by turn by turn elemental activation, having dead 9-drops in your hand is exactly the sort of thing that could break and kill your elemental sequences that you really need. So this is probably not an elemental card despite being an elemental card produced in a set that cares about elementals. I think instead this is actually more like a Highlander card where you just need some of that late game life gain and stabilization, and potentially even leaving a big threat behind that could maybe even kill your opponent sometimes. So that Mega-Windfury can be really scary. Could just be in like a control shaman too. And of course, anytime you're cheating big cards into play early, whatever kind of version of shaman that might be, Walking Mountain could be a great way to do that. We just saw like the Thunderbringer is a card that could maybe cheat some Walking Mountains into play and create some real friction for your opponent trying to deal with that, leaving behind, you know, a Mega-Windfury card on board. If they accidentally kill the Thunderbringer and can't answer the Walking Mountain, oh crap, I'm screwed. So those sort of scenarios exist for this. Those big deck payoff cards, this is about as big of a payoff I think as you can get in many cases. So I actually do think this card's decent. These kinds of cards like this that are so big and so expensive and feel really slow, it's always the same thing, like, oh, this feels too slow, it feels too expensive, but then it's just so rewarding when it hits that there's a deck that finds a way to manipulate that into play early, and suddenly it becomes worth it, right? So think about like the Void Lords of the world, right? Really slow, but it just does so much when it happens that the payoff ends up being worth it. Speaking of big control cards for Shaman here, we also got the Giant Tumbleweed, a 7-mana nature spell. This one deals 6 damage to all minions, and it summons a 6/6 Tumbleweed. And yeah, this is a really good late game AoE. I think that 6 damage is a decently large mark. That's going to clear a lot of different board states, and the fact that you get a 6/6 back on the end of it is actually really nice. This reminds me a lot of the Priest card, the Harmonic and Dissonant 6-mana AoE. Is it just called Harmonic Pop? Maybe that's what it is. You know, that sometimes deals 6 and leaves you behind that 3/3, or deals 3 and leaves you behind that 6/6. For 1 mana more, you kind of get the best of both of that card, which feels like it's worth it for 7 mana. So again, seems like a really cool kind of control Highlander card, or just a control shaman, of which we've actually seen a few times in the last couple of years that can succeed as sort of an off meta, lower tier viable deck. And I think they're getting some pretty cool pieces here in both of these cards. So speaking of control cards, we got another one here, I think. Amphibious Elixir, a 2-mana nature spell. This one restores 5 health, and it discovers a spell. And this is giving me like major Renew vibes, the 1-mana priest card from actually long ago, at this stage, a few years ago, I think. It is 2 mana instead of 1, but it also gives you a little bit of extra health, and I don't think spending 2 mana is really too much to ask on this sort of thing. Sometimes in control decks, you just need ways to fill in gaps, fill out your mana. 2 mana is not a huge ask in many scenarios, and getting some awesome spells on the back end is great. As we also talked about already, Shaman has gotten a handful of like life gain type spells recently. So, you know, there's going to be basically a lot of options to generate additional, you know, board clears like our last card, or just other ways to react to boards or heal yourself up. So I think, in other words, this will allow you to discover a lot of cards that function in kind and are directionally very similar to what this is doing, which helps you build out a nice, consistent sort of game plan. So again, a defensive control-y shaman, or this is perfect for Highlander decks as well, where sometimes you need to build a little bit of extra value out of your deck, and this does that really nicely. So next up here, we've got the Cactus Cutter. This is actually a really good card again, I think. A 2-mana 2/2 Murloc. Battlecry, draw a spell, and if you cast it this turn, gain +1/+2 and taunt. So number one, if you ignore that second sentence, I think this is actually still just a really good card. A 2-mana 2/2 with a type in particular. So, you know, you could obviously run this in Murloc decks and perhaps get some spells to support that, find that Bloodlust or something for your Murloc deck really consistently. But even outside of that, any deck that just wants to draw spells, this is absolutely fine as a way to get some stats in play, get a little body down early, create those little speed bumps and trade opportunities against your opponent's minion-based boards, while still drawing into the stuff you care about for later. So just a ton of consistency. And the great thing about a card like this is, if you draw it later in the game and you're not playing it on turn 2, this second sentence becomes really interesting again, because in many scenarios, you might be able to play that spell right away. And then you get yourself this little taunt body on board, which can still add some value and you know, board relevance later in a game as well, if you're looking to stabilize or get a little bit meatier stats in play you know, on turn 6, on turn 7 or something. This isn't just a useless 2/2 that you throw in for fodder, but it has some potential board relevance. So basically really good on curve on 2 in many cases, and still pretty good late in the game as well. And ultimately just a cheap, efficient way to draw a spell specifically can be really useful. Sometimes that's tutoring a specific spell like Bloodlust. Other times, that's just drawing a spell in a deck with lots of good spells. So this card just looks good. And finally here we have the Trusty Companion. This is a cool 2-mana spell. Give a minion +2/+3. So really good early game buff. And if it has a minion type, draw one of that type. So basically, if you have a minion type deck, that could be elementals, could be murlocs, for instance, you're going to get yourself a nice buff here, potentially even on curve on turn 2. That can be awesome. A great 1-drop followed up with those big stats that often pulls you way ahead, and you're reloading your hand with more stuff to play in those minion based decks, which can be good for those decks. Sometimes they struggle to refill if you've got too many early game minions. Now I will say for like elementals in particular, this is perhaps a little shakier because you know, for instance, may not want to play this on turn 2 if you're trying to play elementals every single turn. So, you know, having dead-ish cards like this in hand for those decks could be a bit of a struggle. This might be something you had to wait to play until like turn 5 or 6, when you can make sure you have enough elementals to play alongside it, and you don't accidentally break up your sequence of elementals for your big sort of scar. So a little bit lower potential on this, I would say, in elementals, but it's still really good. Still plenty of opportunity. You know, murlocs could be awesome for this. Mechs, whatever, you know, comes along. Obviously a lot of different options here, but ultimately a card that does a lot. Card draw, good buff, efficient cost, all things you like to see. Dr. Holiday is a 4-star card. Scar the Catastrophe is a 3-star card. Minecart Cruiser is a 4-star card. Walking Mountain is a 3-star card. Giant Tumbleweed is a 4-star card. Amphibious Elixir is a 3-star card. Trusty Companion is a 4-star card. Cactus Cutter is a 4-star card. Yeah, so I have some really interesting cards. I actually like these Shaman cards quite a bit. I think there are a handful of different directions here that could be pretty exciting. I'm actually least hopeful perhaps for the elemental stuff. I just don't know if that has that critical mass of all the different elementals you need to really get it there. Number one, because of that sequencing, but number two, just like, is the card quality there? You know, are there enough good pieces to make all of that worth it? I don't know that Scar is a good enough payoff. I'm actually a little bit more intrigued by just the good cards that Shaman got, and just, you know, a lot of people talk about like a pile of good cards deck. I think Kibler's been playing like a pile of good cards Shaman. There's suddenly a lot more good cards to pile into that just do uniquely good and interesting things, and seem to have some kind of deck independence almost that seems perfect for a Highlander deck, particularly one that intends to play the game a little bit longer, a little bit more control oriented. So some promising stuff there indeed. I'm actually really excited to play a lot of this, including Dr. Holiday. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on these cards. Of course, share those down in the comments below. Stay tuned for more reviews. Thank you much for watching, and until next time, game on.